There you go. Got it. Got it. But you have to click on it with the mouse. There's a mouse.
Oh, we have to click on it?
We need to click on it.
Oh, you would ask me that. Here, I'm gonna let you do that.
I think the mouse is on the computer.
Yeah. Yeah, you go, that's right, you got the thing.
Just click OK, yeah, so it goes away. Great, perfect. Good morning, everybody. It's 9:30, so we will get started. Well, welcome to all of you on Zoom. Please remember to keep yourselves muted so that we're not picking up background noise, and also to turn off your cameras if you're doing something else while you're listening so other people aren't distracted by that. I am recording this session, and I am going to turn it over to Larry Lynn now to do introductions. Go ahead, Larry.
We all set, Kim?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. Good morning, and welcome to Reparations Unfinished U.S. Business. What is the history and future of reparations in America? What is the case for paying reparations to Black Americans for discrimination and slavery, and Native Americans for various broken promises? These questions will be addressed this morning by our speaker, fellow House member Thomas Reddick. Tom practices international environmental law and liability prevention as Global Environmental Ethics Council, LLC in Spring Lake. He has taught ethics and sustainability to Western Michigan University business students and was president of the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. Tom holds a BA and a JD from the University of Michigan, and as a side note, he likes to cook, play the piano, loves to garden, and participate in sprint triathlons, so he might want to elaborate on that.
Never gonna do an
Anyway, please join me in welcoming fellow House member Thomas Reddick.
Thank you. So this goes just like this, right? No. The other way. There we go. Back. There we go. All right, I think I figured out my microphone. Can you hear me? Careful don't pull my cord out. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. It certainly was an honor to be given this big issue. I saw Fred Johnson do a several-part series on the Tulsa Massacre, and that was a real eye-opener. And I asked a few questions about what about reparations, and Fred said, wow, that's a big issue. So somehow I handled taking on this issue. What I'm going to talk about today, I have a personal goal here. I'm going to be on Fox News, okay? I go to my sister's house for the holidays, and they have Fox News on nonstop, so I get to see all these experts on reparations. There's a young man named Ben Shapiro, and I'll have a slide on him. I was going to do a video of him, but I didn't want to have a technical issue or anything. So there are a bunch of precedents out there. I will talk about our Japanese friends. Native Americans have been given billions. Blacks have a couple billion, but boy, there's a lot more on the table we need to talk about. Slavery is a big thing that happened a long time ago. How do we deal with it? Well, it's probably not going to be something that a court could really address, because there's real good reasons why we have statutes of limitations that prevent people from suing for things that happened like in biblical times. The Black reparations are similar to, I did a book chapter and have done a lot of speeches on climate change liability, and there's hundreds of cases and none of them hit for big money, but I gotta feel that there's going to be a huge payout at some point. And I think reparations for Black folks, it's similar, that it's such a big issue and the courts are having trouble dealing with it that it's going to take probably a congressional, even the United Nations, or 50 states one by one to deal with this. So Bernie Sanders is the person they choose to pick on when they go to Fox News. They say, Bernie says pay reparations, and Ben Shapiro gets up and says, that just can't happen. That's a completely unworkable socialist, and he cites Barack Obama. Why would we give any money to him? Well, we wouldn't, because he's still got a white mother, a Kenyan father. No connection to slavery or lynching. So he also says it's impossible to create a metric. Well, as I'll walk you through, we have had metrics for reparations before, so we just need to figure out how to apply it in this case. And even Ben Shapiro, when he gets up and says there is no basis for this, will say, well, wait a minute, a Jim Crow act that was pretty recent, and actually there are Jim Crow acts that have been sued on and got millions of dollars. So there's a basis when you don't have something so far away in time. So I think we could work with the Fox News folks, and I'm going to be their expert to say, here's how you do it. Good luck with that, Tom. Over the years of representing, I mainly represented the agriculture sector, the corn growers and the grain traders. And with them, we developed theories to collect billions of dollars in economic damages when someone disrupts an overseas market like China, and you ship half the soybeans there, and they disrupt it by selling a GMO that isn't approved. Bingo, you get $1 billion. And we just invented that out of whole cloth. Now, I think that something similar needs to be done with reparations. You need to look at the law and say, can we just reach one circle out of our little circle, right? Just move the law a little bit. Causation is required when you have a wrong that needs to be righted, and that means you have to prove that, you know, he ran over me with my car, and there's a photo evidence of it, and so on and so forth. You could do things that are multi-generational, but the courts have struggled with that. And the reason is there's a statute of limitations for everything except murder. And that means you have to sue within a certain time of being hurt. There's a good reason for this. In the Middle Ages, they had people who would do a wrong thing and then they'd just wait. And they'd wait until all the other people were dead and then say, oh, I got hurt and nobody else can say it because everybody else died. I'm here and I want my money now. Well, you don't want people sandbagging you. I think this is moving on its own accord. Okay, well. So I will agree with Ben Shapiro, slavery reparations is a bit of a stretch, but whether it's Congress, the United Nations, or 50 states one by one, we're going to get reparations eventually. The key takeaway here is that justice moves very slowly, and it will eventually move billions of dollars to those who have decent claims. And I say the blacks are going to catch up with the U.S. tribes because, boy, I had no idea until I started researching this how much money has gone to the Native Americans in the last 20 years. And here's why I'm qualified to be on Fox News. I did write a book on liability prevention. I actually got paid to write that book. Usually lawyers do everything for free because we just do it to get clients, right? And they actually paid me. I was like, you seriously going to pay me? Okay, well, okay, that's fine. I mentioned that I had these creative nuisance and negligence theories that worked in the courts for billions of dollars. I'm white enough to be on Fox News. I voted for a Republican once. You know, my speaking career hopefully will take off. And I hope you think after you've heard me speak about this today that yes, I did the research and I'm qualified to stand up here and do this speech because a couple of my family members who I gave a practice speech said, why are you talking about this? Well, that's why. This reparations thing joins billions of dollars that have changed hands. For everything we invent has a billion-dollar problem. Ocean ships, the Titanic, trains, planes, electricity, which Thomas Edison warned us. There's a great movie called The Current War, where Edison says, alternating current will kill people. Don't use alternating. Use the direct current. Well, my laptop here does have direct current, but it also has AC, because it would not run like this without it. And it kills 3 people a week, and we just tolerate it, right? Because we need it. I want to be here speaking. Therefore, 3 people just died, right? This is what we do in the world. Vaccines are a problem now because some people don't take them. But the fact is, if they were hurt by the vaccine, there's a great system of vaccine compensation where all you have to prove is the vaccine caused the problem, not that the biotech company that made it was negligent or that someone did something wrong. It's just you get paid. So in the world of compensation, we don't always look for a clear fault path. We sometimes say as a matter of policy, if you're hurt, you get paid. And the Native Americans have collected billions, as I will discuss next. One little point on how I also saw the needle move in the law. We had this big Aaron Brockovich case where a bunch of people got poisoned by a known carcinogen, right? And they were injured in their genes, and the courts were struggling with this. Well, how do we deal with genes injuries? So what they did is they paid them billions of dollars in medical monitoring to monitor a huge number of people for possible cancer. So the courts are willing to do creative things, folks, and I'm hopeful to persuade you, at least, that this could be done. And I also had a case called the DES, it's short for a long word, which was a morning sickness drug that caused cancer problems in women. It actually caused problems in their grandchildren, and those grandchildren collected. So we can do multi-generational claims here. And we did pay reparations for something bad once. The Japanese had a case called Horomatsu. This very brave World War II vet said, "Why did we get all interned when we're brave, loyal people fighting for you? Why did you lock us all up?" When I was a young lawyer, my brother was an engineer in San Diego for a man named Jack Kubota. And he was interned with his sister and their family. And his sister got a simple ear infection and died in the camp because they didn't have any access to the right medical care. And he said that they took my sister away. And sure, they're going to give me a check, but this is a troubling thing. So we paid him about $1 billion. Direct payments to Japanese who showed they were connected. So there's a precedent for you. And by the way, they couldn't prove it because the statute of limitations would not allowed them to say back in 50 years ago I was hurt. You should have filed it 10 years after you were hurt. Over in Europe, we have Germany, which did the whole Nazi Holocaust, and they actually said, we're sorry to Israel, and paid them $845 million for their Nazi war crimes. And there's an interesting way they did it. They actually made it into a trade deal. So there was a win-win. They showed the German people, we will have economic benefit if we do this deal. And it got done. And I think in America, we're going to have to do a similar thing with reparations and say, if it doesn't stimulate the economy or do something good for everyone, it's not going to get done. Oh, gosh, this thing keeps advancing without me asking it to. Sorry about that. I didn't think I had a timing thing on it. So Native Americans also, it's on the next 20 minutes or so, I'll talk about how much money we've paid the Native Americans. Who knew, right? $4 billion and water rights, which were worth probably another $1 billion. So Native American reparations are divided into these 5 categories. First, we have the Arizona water rights, which started in the 60s and basically gave them the rights to the Colorado River. And sorry, Mexico, you don't get any. And San Diego, you're going to have to hire Tom and his law firm to get a bunch of farmers to cover their fields to get any water because the Native Americans in Arizona just got a bunch. Everybody was surprised when that happened because we don't usually do these things for people we oppressed. What is going on? Obama made a commitment and he paid them $3.4 billion in oil profits in 2012. That was tied to royalties that 7 tribes had rights to that were never paid and that were stolen from them, basically. There's also an Oklahoma case where the Supreme Court said half of Oklahoma is a reservation. And I looked at that and I thought, wow, does that mean all the Indians get back their land? No. That means when they committed a crime, they will have a different court. There was a recent case that I'll talk about. This is basically just what I'm going to say, and Native, I'll go into these each more. There was another case, very recent, in 2016, where $492 million went for mismanagement of reservations. So starting with this Arizona water litigation, and yeah, it's 50 years ago, but it's a huge case because it just recognized that you have to give Native rights to the water that they need to live. And this basically is to make the reservations livable. And being lawyers, the Supreme Court adopted a very complicated standard called the practicably irrigable acreage standard, which just basically means the water has to be there for them to irrigate to make crops and such. The Navajo folks are, the Navajos actually had an even bigger issue because they're in southern Utah where the water is very scarce, and they applied, they have a spiritual issue. Water's healing for all beings placed on earth, and they consider it part of their necessary things, and the Supreme Court has recognized that. And they applied this old case called Winters and basically got a priority date from when they were given the land, which means that's pretty far way back. Okay. And they do not lose it. It's a use it or lose it system in prior appropriation of water. It's the Western rule. Here in the East, we just have a different reasonable use standard. But out West, if you have a water right, you have to keep using it or somebody can take it from you. And if you're Native American, no, that rule doesn't apply to you because we told you you get this water in perpetuity, whether you use it all the time or not. And under the way this works is they go to court, they say we get the water, and then Congress has to allocate funds under this practical irrigable acreage. There's 8 factors that they apply. They're very complicated when you dig into this. You have hire hundreds of experts. And eventually, by proving through agronomy and soil issues and market studies and the economic basis, they get $220 million. And what do they do with it? Well, here's a map. It's a bit of an eye chart, but there are little black dots that are far away from the blue lines. And there's enough little black dots that's $220 million of piping and pumps and stuff to get people who can flush their toilet and wash their dishes. There have been other tribes applying this Arizona standard, so there frankly has been, there's enough of these people doing this Native American litigation that my environmental section of the ABA has a booming Native American law committee of just hundreds of lawyers who do this thing. Bighorn, way up there in the Wind River, got a substantial surface rights applying this Arizona case. Interestingly, they didn't get any municipal use, but it doesn't matter, they don't have a city. Mescalero Apache down in Mexico failed to get a PIA award from the court, but they still managed to get some groundwater for historical, based on their historic use. So what the tribes did here was capture rights that when we sold them in the Imperial Immigration District were worth millions. So this is probably at least $500 million worth of water they're talking about. If you ever could give a price to water, which we did actually in California once. There was a more recent case that just settled in 2016 in the waning days of the Obama administration, where the U.S. recognized that we have mismanaged your reservations in so many ways. I mean, it's 20 pages in the brief, that we need to pay these 17 tribes $492 million. And this all arose from when Obama was a candidate. He actually went to reservations and did speeches. And at the Crow Nation Reservation, he said, we've got hundreds of these mismanagement cases, and we're going to settle these cases, including the oil royalty case. And I mentioned the Oklahoma case. The key thing to remember there, yeah, half of Oklahoma is a reservation, but nobody got any land back. And that could be the next reparations case brought by the Native Americans saying, you cheated me out of this land, this land, this land, this land. And if they can show they were not treated fairly, maybe they get reparations. There's another issue in Native Americans that we also have in the Boy Scouts and we have in the universities, and it's the kids being mistreated. There's been a lot of sexual depredation going on, and there's currently a big investigation being undertaken both in Canada and America, to look at the history of how we handled Native American boarding schools. And one thing Biden did is he appointed Deb Haaland, who's an actual tribe member, to be the Department of Interior with oversight of all the Native American issues. So I predict this will be the next big, litigation award of some kind that after this investigation is complete. Lastly, almost lastly, I actually heard on NPR when I was out in Zion National Park that there's folks saying the Native Americans should be given control of the national parks and they should be able to collect all the fees from the national parks. Well, that's another reparations type argument that, hey, you took this land from us, it's our sacred space, shouldn't we be allowed to at least manage it? The other thing NPR reported on that could become a reparations issue is, those places that we moved everybody to, instead of being in Georgia, they're in western Oklahoma. That is very arid country. It's harder to farm, and the climate change issues are much worse there than they are in Georgia, where we, before the Trail of Tears, had them living. So there could be issues reparation related to that. I mean, the climate change is going to make it harder to live where we put them. Is Biden going to support anything? Well, he certainly is supporting the tribes. He is the White House hosted the first summit of the tribal nations since the Obama era. And he actually finally renamed Columbus Day Indigenous People Day as a federal matter. I mentioned Deb Haaland being appointed. That's historic. First Native American ever to run the agency that runs the Native Americans. About time we had somebody who is from the tribe lead the tribe. Joe Biden actually spent 2 days with the Navajo Nation. I hope they took her to Zion National Park because, boy, that's really gorgeous, and I just spent a few days there. November is Native American. It's good we're doing this month because it's Native American Heritage Month. So there you go. I really do think if there's more money on the table, Biden will figure out a way, whether it's on this molestation issue or the various issues with parks. Could be something Biden does, similar to how Obama tried to correct a lot of the broken promises to Native Americans. One of the big things he just did, which is $31 billion, is during the COVID pandemic, these tribes suffered greatly. And he, in his coronavirus relief package, set aside $31 billion. And this helped to make some of the highest vaccination rates now are in the tribes, which suffered twice as much. It's funny because they suffered twice as much from violent crimes and rapes, and it's also they had twice as much COVID. So, we need to take care of these folks. At this point, I'm going to go on to the black reparations, and I'll just ask, are there any questions? And if we have a chat message question, feel free to, how do we do the chats, Larry?
Tom, there's nothing in the chat yet.
Nothing in the chat. Any questions from the room, though, before we move on to, yes, sir. He's got a microphone so the Zoom folks can hear your question.
Whenever I think of law cases, I think of you have to prove standing. So how do you prove standing in all your examples?
Oh, certainly. I didn't want to drill down too far into the lanes of law, but I will give you a quick. When you come into court, the first thing the court looks at is, do you have standing? Are you allowed to sue? And it means you have to have an actual injury. So I'll get into this in the black section there, because basically, if you are not the person who is hurt, you don't get to sue. Environmental groups run into this all the time. If they haven't been given standing by Congress, they can't come and say that river, I'm representing the river and it needs to, be cleaned up. So standing is something that in all of those Native American issues, there were injured people. Okay, and actually, you'll find in almost all the black problems we have injured people. So there shouldn't be any representational kind of problem unless one of the associations says we're going to sue for a class of black injured people. So standing here in reparations cases where you have injuries that are being compensated, all the Japanese had standing because they were all interned and they all got money. And similarly, most of the Indian, the royalty issues, all those people were injured. It's an article in the Constitution, injury in fact you only get in court if you're actually injured. And there's another codicil or whatever. You only get into court if you're actually injured and it happened within the statute of limitations. So we're going to talk about that now. So this movie, elements of black reparations, we start with the trauma of the slavery era. And this goes back to 1619 when the first slave arrived here. A lot of this has got tied up in this critical race theory controversy. And I've never seen such a kerfluffle about such a silly thing. I mean, there's a good article in The Atlantic that just shows, they're just digging into history and showing that there's more we have to learn about it. They're not saying we're all bad people. It's saying we haven't quite figured out what we did to the black people and we need to talk about it. The Jim Crow effects and these black codes that we passed in the 1800s and that carried on into the 80s, we had people lynched in the 1980s, so this is not some old thing here we're talking about. During my lifetime, somebody was hung up and lynched. Entire towns were destroyed during my grandfather's time. Equity in homes has been building up to a 10-to-1 ratio of white folks to the black folks. 10-to-1, how did that happen? Well, I'll talk about how that happened. Well, a long time ago, right after the Civil War, Callie House was a washerwoman, and she was black, and she saw all her black kinsmen coming home from slavery, and none of them had a nickel to their name. And a lot of them were old folks who couldn't even carry out a job, and she said, we need to do something here. So she sued the government and said, look at all this cotton we confiscated, and these guys picked it. So shouldn't they use this cotton money to fund housing and food and necessary medical care? And I thought it was a good idea when I read about it, but guess what the government did? They said they sent out investigators and found something to accuse her of, and then locked her up. How dare you sue us and ask for the cotton? Somebody probably writing a book about her, because this is a great story of how someone long ago tried to get reparations, and guess what? We locked her up. What do we have here in Michigan? We've got the Northwest Ordinance, and when this state was being voted in, only white people could vote. So we started out with a only whites vote rule in the Northwest. Then the Midwest states, Indiana was the worst of them, had all these founding laws that even Oregon, way out on the West Coast, had a law, no black people allowed. And even free black people sometimes were not allowed in a state, even in the more liberal states, without proving to a judge that they were free and that they could support themselves. And they'd pay these exorbitant fees. So the other thing we have up here in the north is sundown towns. And that's where by sundown, all the black people better leave town. Okay, and we have a lot of very popular destinations in Michigan, Grosse Pointe, Dearborn, there's about 50 towns that were sundown towns, and you just better not stay here after dark or we'll put a bullet in your head. I used to live in St. Louis, Missouri, where my corn and soybean growers were based, and I lived through that whole Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, Michael Brown, thing, and what I didn't know until I started researching this presentation was that was a sundown town into the 60s. So there was all these folks who might be nice people with happy lives, but they just don't want a black person around. Even Spring Lake, and I'm going to debate this because it's on the list of sundown towns, and I looked into the data. Yeah, in 1851, somebody got accused of stealing a chicken, so they ran all the black people out of town thinking they were chicken thieves. And sure, that's a sundown town, but not as bad as some others in defense of Spring Lake. So moving forward to 1919, in the post-World War I environment, we had a very racist president who supported the Ku Klux Klan and showed the birth of the nation film, D.W. Griffith's story making the Ku Klux Klan look great, and they put white people in blackface being rapists and cruel people, and it's a horrible movie. But he showed it in the White House in endorsing the KKK and kind of gave them an ability to fundraise, an ability to membership. Around the same time, we have the Russian Revolution, and communism rears its ugly head, and when the NAACP got founded, they said, oh, you must be a communist organization, just as a way to say, you wonder how they ever got to that. So, but part of it is involved in labor strife, which is big. They had the Wobblies, and they were bringing in the police to shoot them down then. And this labor strife violence ran parallel to blacks, because blacks were often brought in as the scab workers. And then, when they try to organize and make a black union, they shoot them for doing that. So it's a catch-22. You're either a scab or you're a union, and either way, they're going to get you. So there's something in 1919 called the Red Summer, where they just started attacking blacks in 37 different cities. In Elaine, Arkansas, once again, the farmers were trying to organize, the black farmers were forming a union, and they started shooting them, and that led to 240 people dead. A little town called Osogee, Florida, which only had 24 houses, had 35 people in this little black community, killed by another mob coming in based on one of the farmers tried to vote. And boy, okay, we'll take the whole town out. I could probably spend a whole hour talking about the other 30-some cities, because East St. Louis, Chicago, D.C., all of them had huge riots against black neighborhoods just like that. And it's just repeated all through this summer of 1919. And 2 years later, we get the Tulsa Massacre. Now, this was a part of a several-part series with Fred Johnson, so I'm just going to give you a quick Reader's Digest version. But here's this gal, Viola Fletcher. She's 107 years old. This was a photo of her recent congressional hearing where she testified about what happened in Tulsa. And this is a horrible event in human history. Because a little kid was about to be lynched. He was in jail. And a white mob tried to come and take him out of jail. And the black mob tried to keep him in jail. And somehow a shot rang out, and boom, the whites decided to take an entire thing called Black Wall Street. It was the pillar of the black community in the U.S. It had banks. It had, everything a good neighborhood should have. And these people were well-dressed, had nice houses, right? And they went and said, no, you don't get that. And they actually somehow got government planes to come and strafe little kids, strafing little American children with our planes while we burn an entire city down. So, like I said, there was several hours of Fred Johnson telling us about this, so I won't repeat that. But when you have 10,000 blacks homeless, property damage in today's dollars at $32.65 million, and people burning down hospitals with the people in it, and banks and homes burned down. This is something that has this sort of compelling story that you think somebody should have got paid, right? Somebody should have collected some money. Get a jury on this, you're going to get millions. Well, within days, we had President Harding, who was the president at the time, said, God grant that in the soberness, the fairness, and the justice of the country, we never see another spectacle like this. But within 2 years, somebody in Rosewood, Florida decided, we don't like what those black people did, so they had wiped out the town. So the towns just keep getting wiped out, by the way. This is not something that ended here. And so what kind of justice could we have for this? Nobody did anything until a representative in Oklahoma, Rep. Don Ross, created a commission in the 90s. So there was, for basically almost 80 years, nobody even investigated what happened here. And he lays out how this could have come about. We had a bunch of black codes after the 1876 presidential election that just basically gave the South the right to manage all these issues. They managed them with voting restrictions, property ownership restrictions, marriage statutes limiting interracial love. And what didn't happen anywhere is anybody getting into court and suing about Tulsa. In his 200-page reports, he talks about how people did come back to Tulsa in the 20s within the statute of limitations, and the white courts would not even hear their case. It's like, sorry, black people can't sue in our courts. So they covered it up into the 70s. Nobody could even do a journalistic investigation because no one would talk. And in the 1970s, it started to get exposed because a few people started to talk. And so for 78 years, we had all this oppression and killing and theft and burning down cities. We have all these poll taxes where we have to pay to vote, poll quizzes for only the blacks. Grandfather clauses mean if your grandfather voted, you get to vote. If your grandfather couldn't vote because he's a slave, you don't get to vote. And surprisingly, in 2013, I was stunned at this case. The Supreme Court said, look, the voting rights issue with blacks, that's over. There's no more issues. Sorry, we don't think the Department of Justice should scrutinize any of these statutes that the southern states come up with because, nobody has a problem with that. Well, actually, we do have a problem with that because after this recent election where they claimed voter fraud, right, they are now writing laws in various southern states that will basically try to keep black people from voting again. And they voted during COVID by mail. They're trying to restrict that. They did Sunday voting. They're trying to restrict it. And as far as I can tell, the Supreme Court dropped the ball here because there's still problems in the South with people trying to disenfranchise blacks. There's also, for purposes of looking at the wealth gap, it starts with sharecropping. So basically, we have a lot of black people who are, if they did work hard and managed to get a nice community going, people would come by force and fraud and take it away. Not always burning it down, just by law and courts, take away their property and make them into a tenant farmer. So then they're basically like a slave without an overseer because they're just a tenant working for the same plantation. And they could not go get another job, even at a car wash or whatever it may be, because there were restrictions on you could not hire a black into any other job other than this. And we actually had the Supreme Court come up with it. They were presented with this issue in 1896, and they said, "Oh, that's fine. It's separate, but it's equal." No, it's not. Okay. That was a dark day in Supreme Court history. So there is a foundation for the Tulsa Massacre, and the Greenwood Foundation continues to raise money and to try to raise, more importantly, awareness. And they have sent a letter to the Attorney for Civil Rights at the Department of Justice saying, please informally investigate this massacre. For the first time, the federal government could investigate it, because the other investigation was by the Oklahoma government. There's this Viola, the 107-year-old person who was a 7-year-old when her town was burned down around her, who still tearfully testifies, and she has actual standing to sue, right? But the statute of limitations ran back when they told them they couldn't get into the court because they're black. So that sounds like a little bit of a problem to me. A little legal problem, and we do have, as I'll discuss later, there are exceptions to the statute of limitations that could be applied. There's been recent congressional hearings. I commend you to them. They're on YouTube. You can watch them all. You can watch the Republicans grandstand, and you can watch the people talk, including Viola. So what is the Greenwood Foundation doing today? They do have a nuisance case they filed in federal court, and this is where we might see the statute of limitations waived based on the fraud and wrongdoing. They've asked for unjust enrichment because their land was taken away. Give us the fair market value of that. And they're going to get the money to build the hospital to replace what was burnt down in that neighborhood. And the insurance industry's been invited to the party, so they are considering the claims that are being made here. What we do have is a case that if the courts are brave enough, they can say, if you couldn't get into court, the statute of limitations does not run because you're not being allowed to sue. So if you're prevented from suing, you should be able to sue later. The foundation has told the truth about this Greenwood Max. One of the things I didn't know, even in Fred's presentation, if you had a bank book and it burned up, the bank, which is a white bank, said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have any record of your money," and they just kept it. So here you are, you're homeless, and you can't even access your funds to, go on the road and get out of Dodge. They're trying to trace all the mass graves that were, they had a lot of dead people, they just buried them in trenches. And they're going to track down the diaspora, the scattering of these people to the winds with no money because their bank books were burned. They're going to see if they can find them and give them funds. Unfortunately, so far, this Jim Crow litigation has always failed in the courts. And what we keep hearing from the judges is they need current activity and current harm. And they keep telling us why statutes of limitations serve a useful purpose. And they do. They serve a very useful purpose in keeping current cases in and not letting people sandbag and wait till the witnesses die and then come in and talk. And in 2004, a similar case was brought to the one that just was filed in Tulsa. And the judge there said, "There is such terrible devastation here, I really want to do something. But my hands are tied because there's this statute of limitations I must enforce." And I think he's being a little too cowardly and not say, this is a quick slide on statute of limitations. We had a discussion of standing. That's one issue. You have to have a right to sue. You also have to sue in time. You have to do it within the time frame set in the statute. Now, there are exceptions, and some of them are sensible statutory. If you're a minor and you're molested, you can't be expected to run to court. If you're a felon and you can't even get out of jail to file a suit, also we give you a pass for that. If you're off in Bolivia doing medical research and you weren't in town to sue, they'll give If you're even bankrupt by your own stupidity, you still get the statute told. But if you are somehow, if your town was burned, if your cousin was lynched, if anything else, these courts have not been willing to apply any statutory thing, and that's because the one they should be doing is equitable. There is an equitable exception to the statute of limitations. This has been carried out in the modern era for people who wake up one morning and say, I was molested when I was a kid. And they go to the psychologist, and the psychologist helps them with their repressed memory. And 20 years later, even though statute of limitations ran, the court says, well, I believe this testimony of the psychiatrist, you can sue that person. Here we have, like in Tulsa, 70 years of silence. When the people tried to sue within the statute of limitations, they were told, black people can't come to court here, we don't care. This is a ground for equitable tolling. Now, it's a big reach, it's a long time. That doesn't mean it isn't doable. It just means we haven't had the courage in the court to say, I hereby declare that Tulsa gets to sue for what happened. And you hope some judge has the bravery to take a stand. Because to me, it's, as I'll agree with Fred Johnson, this is a big thing to swallow, right? But it's not a thing that is unswallowable, because there is equitable tolling, and this is the worst example I've ever seen of people being, by force and fraud, deprived of property and by not being given access to the courts, and then being told, well, sorry guys, you waited too long. No, they weren't waiting. They were running in fear from people who were trying to lynch them. So there's definitely going to be something going on in Tulsa with this new litigation. I really do hope this judge has the courage to say equitable tolling means that the statute of limitations is not going to be enforced here. Let's see whether there is actual evidence of causation. And that's where this Greenwood Foundation is doing a good job of tracking down people and tracking down facts. Even independent of litigation, this Human Rights Watch did a recent report and noted that everybody's getting turned away from the courts, but that doesn't mean we can't do something. And so they've recommended we do business boost grants. That'd be like a redevelopment fund that could put black businesses on the road to recovery. In light of COVID, there's a lot of need for that in the communities that have lost restaurants, lost, various businesses. You could also build a decent memorial in Tulsa so that people, I'm going to talk in a minute about the Lynching Memorial in Montgomery. A similar monument would give people a tourist destination on the Civil Rights Trail to come and hear about Tulsa and see in a museum or a memorial what happened. The Human Rights Watch also said we should really subsidize the housing of these folks who've been sent off with no bank book and no ability to live. It's probably 100 years late, but at least we could help their grandkids get college or something. So there's got to be something that business, local governments could start doing on the reparations front. Congress could fund it all if we just get a Congress that could act. And we can't, at this point, Congress has yet to even commission the investigation that was asked for 30 years ago by John Conyers. So there's going to be a long road to get this done. The Greenwood Foundation, though, has basically said, we're going to seek financial compensation in court and in Congress. We're going to have accountability for this. We're going to find the diaspora, and we're going to say these people need to be paid. They've already given each of them $100,000 from their foundation, and they're going to see if they can't get into court or get into Congress and actually start to heal some of what happened here. My father and I took a trip just before COVID down to the Montgomery, Alabama Lynching Memorial. And Brian Stevenson's a famous civil rights lawyer. He even had a movie about him on one of his death penalty appeal cases. And he created a foundation and created this lynching monument. And it basically sets the stage for 4,000 some wrongful death cases, if you could ever get them into court. Each county has its own column. It's kind of a rusty metal square, and it's etched with the names and the dates of people who were lynched in that county. So I was wheeling my father through this memorial, and we're looking at all these columns. We finally found Michigan, and yep, we did lynch people in Michigan. And here's North Carolina, a church group, and they're looking at this column. There's about 12 North Carolina columns for each of the counties that had 50 or so people. And they find their county, and we start talking with them, and they said, well, we're a church group from North Carolina, and we are here because our city council commissioned us to come to this memorial and look at these columns and find our column and see if we can hang it in the courthouse square back in our town in North Carolina. And they said, but believe you me, half the city council thinks, we should never have torn down the statue of Stonewall, so it's going to be a big political question when we bring this issue back to the city council in North Carolina. What this does is it makes every county that ever lynched anybody have to talk about this. You should come here, you should look at your column and put it in, we'll give you a copy to put in your county, courthouse square. And we met a group from North Carolina who walked us through the whole, how this is going to be a tough road to hoe when we get home, but we're going to try. I think this sort of memorial does a lot to move forward the question of what do we do about the wrongdoing that we've done. And I mentioned wrongful death is something. O.J. Simpson was sued for wrongful death and paid a big judgment for it, made him bankrupt. Even though he was declared innocent by a court, that's a higher standard of law. And in wrongful death, you just have to, more likely than not, you killed. So all of these lynched people have a really solid wrongful death claim. The only thing keeping them out is the statute of limitations, and as I mentioned, there's an equitable tolling that could be applied. So if the court in Tulsa approves equitable tolling for the Tulsa 1920 massacre, somebody from 1930s even, or 1980, there's all these lynched folks could say, I have a wrongful death claim. The relatives could say, I'm entitled to payment for the person they wrongfully killed. For example, there's an Oliver Moore that I had a photo of. 1930, Oliver Moore, if he decided, if his family said, Oliver was wrongfully killed and we can prove it. Here's the data. You don't get on this thing unless you show them the proof that you were killed. So this means there's proof of a death in the files of this foundation. If you can get past the statute of limitations, each one of these cases could be paid. And this is a photo I got off NPR. I won't linger on it, but these people used to have parties and bring barbecue and kids, and it was just, it's like the Christians and the Lions, right? It's crazy that we had this in America. So these survivor statutes, if you had hostile white judges, hostile silence, and lynchings continued through 1981, you should still be able to waive the statute under equitable tolling and let people collect for the wrong that was done. There was one last, I think this is the last, although God knows Google might show us another one yesterday that I didn't find. In 1981, there was a lynching, and they collected millions of dollars. So they didn't have any problem with the statute of limitations. They quickly went into court and said, hey, they did this to me, I want money, $7 million. So it can be done, and it only needs to have an equitable tolling of the statute of limitations. Moving on to cases where actually somebody succeeded. Black farmers. When I was a young lawyer, I went to a conference where I heard the Secretary of Agriculture speak about Pigford, which is a black class action that basically said, you didn't give us any loans when you're funding all the white farmers, but nobody gave a black farmer a loan. For 50 years of farm loans, we didn't ever get a nickel. And it's true, it was a racist policy that we don't give black people money. Well, now they're giving them money. So the first class action got $1.06 billion, and the next one, about a year later, got $1.25 billion, a total $2.31 billion to recognize that, yeah, we just prevented people from ever getting in to get a loan to do agriculture. And if you know any farmers, boy, they live on loans. They don't get a new, they go to get one of those huge tractors you see now. You better believe they're loaning that against the $10 corn they're going to be selling for 5 years to come. One thing I will note here, they keep talking about how there used to be 50,000, or there's only 50,000 black farmers today, and there used to be 1 million. And I'll give a little caveat to that. I represent farmers, and I can tell you, just in my lifetime, the number of farmers has declined precipitously from death and from going out of business. There's concentration. Farms are getting bigger and bigger. Some of them have 20,000, 10,000 acre farms where there used to be like 100 acre farms. And so the number of black farmers that have really been knocked out of business by the failure to loan is probably more like 500,000, but that's still a lot of farmers to be knocked out of business. As far as other reparations, yes, reparations is being paid in America today. The City Council of Evansville, Illinois, allocated $10 million for reparations for blacks, and they're going to use it for basically correcting the mortgage problems, correcting the business problems. A bunch of other cities, I won't walk through them all, but if you, the list is growing every day of cities, and it'll eventually just be entire states that say we're allocating funds to deal with the fact that we have a 10-to-1 wealth gap between blacks and whites, and we have long history of never mortgaging anything anywhere in their community, because the same thing that happened to the black farmers happened to everybody trying to buy a house in a black neighborhood. They never could get, they're redlined out of it. So there's so much that has gone on that when you sit down and you're a city council and say, yeah, we have some funds, but what could we do? And this city said this will be helpful. And there's probably a win-win behind it. There's probably going to be something like a better social structure, a more economically profitable area. That's why they do it. We could do this in Congress, right? There is, right now, finally we're getting a little more attention to this 30-year-old John Conyers investigation reparations bill. All he's asking is that you take a hard look at it, appoint a commission to look at this question. And this H.R. 40 has finally made a comeback. So I'm happy to say that we're going to start to finally get the common law to reach back. And I can say this common law is able to do this. When someone is hurt, I've gone back 100 years to find cases. The Tulsa heirs should be able to sue from 100 years ago. And the lynching list, I'm actually moderately confident that some court someday will say equity must toll this statute. These people deserve to be paid. Ta-Nehisi Coates has a really good article in the Atlantic, which takes a big chunk of this reparations issue and talks about mainly the wealth issues, particularly redlining in real estate. So this is a real eye-opener, I must say. We have a guy named Charles Abrams, who is the housing authority. He said, we look like Nazi Germany here with our racial laws on housing. We're excluding people based on race. All this led to a 1995 book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, which just shows the 10-to-1 ratio of whites have 10 times more than blacks in wealth. And we all remember the 2008 crash. What led to that was people doing loans to folks who couldn't afford the house anyway, right? And they gave them terrible adjustable rate loans, and the whole thing cratered and destroyed the economy. So there's a reason why we shouldn't have folks who are so deprived of housing living next to us. They can take our whole economy down. One of the things that I mentioned how everybody ended up a tenant farmer, and he has a great discussion of how Mississippi used tricks and laws and fees to basically steal the land out from under blacks, so turn them into tenant farmers. He also talked in major cities how there's these contract buyer problems that NPR just had a session on Detroit's similar problem with people selling people houses that are going to cost more to fix up than you would pay to buy them. Ferguson, Missouri actually was exposed after the Black Lives Matter movement triggered a lot of investigation. Turns out Ferguson, the reason people were so angry and got so mad at a boy lying in the street, these people had been basically funding the government through fees. The government of Ferguson is a little town next to St. Louis. It has to keep its budget, has to pay the police, and how they do it is charge people fees, and one of the problems is the local business community would not hire anyone who hadn't paid all their fees. So you had to kind of make a servant class basically by ensuring that they always have to pay. When they don't show up, they get a big charge, and then they lose their job, and the charge just keeps going up. So Ferguson now has a black city council that doesn't have that, fee situation, but it took a Black Lives Matter and riots and tanks and the whole 9 yards of that to get there. I've got an ad from my buddy who wrote a painting for peace, because after Ferguson burned down, people had plywood, and artists in the community just came and painted a bunch of cool stuff, to say, we're still here. So there is a legacy we're standing on of redlining in real estate. Essentially, they take a red pencil and they say these are hazardous areas, and they're always the black or the Hispanic area, right? And as a result, we have now got, in one study, 212,000 more wealth in our pockets than the black folks have in their pockets, because we benefited from this wrongful act. This was actually declared wrongful in 1968. So maybe the prior equity, you have a little better argument, but you still have an ill-gotten gain sitting in your pocket. And I have a huge ill-gotten gain because I lived in California. I was a lawyer at a big law firm, and I made twice as much from my house one year than I made as a high-priced lawyer, right? I was like, this is crazy. How did I make this money? Well, I made that money because I sat in Del Mar, California for 4 years while the thing doubled in value. It's amazing what housing can do for wealth. And if you take it away from people, you don't even let them have a mortgage, and you don't even let them look at the house, you get Los Angeles, where this is a red line map, a good example. All the red areas are places where nobody gets a mortgage. So what do you think that does to property values? Well, I can tell you, if you have to borrow everything from grandma and grandpa to buy a house, you're not going to have as nice a house. I have a personal experience down in St. Louis, Missouri, where I was a partner in a law firm. I moved there from California with my significant housing money, and I had to roll it over into a house. So I'm basically a cash buyer. And they gave me a broker who was the chairman of the local city council, and she said, oh, don't worry, I've got a professor who's retiring from Washington University, and I'll just give you his house, and we'll just work it out so it doesn't have to go on the market. You just can buy it for fair market value, and we'll negotiate what upside he needs. So we did that. Well, I later, in a church meeting, met some of my black friends in other parts of St. Louis, and they said, why can't we ever get into St. Louis? There's never an inventory. There's no broker who will even show me a house, and it is a probable. I just saw a little corner of it, right? But I'm thinking there may still be something going on here that is the reason all my neighbors are white. And tricks like this have been able to keep the equity in us. And I do think there's a good argument. Well, if a black person moves in, since we're all racist, the property values go down. So that's kind of one of those, yeah, it's true, but there's the root problem is your racism, not that the property values went down. So what can we do here? Congress can act, but can this Congress act on this? They can't even seem to get H.R. 40, the investigation law, passed. Although there are 100 sponsors in the House and 17 or so in the Senate. So there may be something happen on H.R. 40. What I do think is that states and cities are going to lead the way on this. And we've seen, down in Illinois, we've got an actual reparation. We've got many cities doing it. I think entire states, some of the blue states, are going to start to act on this. And you'll see a state legislature make a move, and other states will follow suit. Similar things happened with gay marriage, cannabis. You see this kind of domino effect within the states. I mean, cannabis is legal in like 11 states and medical in like 38 now. It's like, and it just took, Oregon saying this had to happen. So I think we're going to see a role for churches as well, and it's something that will happen and is starting to happen already. So it'll be fun to watch this happen. Now, will the Bible support us? I don't know. We had the slave owners kept quoting, the servants be subject to your masters with all respect. Not just the good, but the unjust. Well, that excuses slavery, right? No. If you look in the Old Testament, the Israelites were slaves once, and God told them, furnish them, free your slave after 7 years, and furnish him from your own flock and your own stuff, and get him off where he needs to go. We didn't do that with the slaves. We didn't even give them the cotton. So I think we have a biblical, ethical obligation here. And what happens when you don't follow the Bible? God sends a lightning bolt. So turning to the major ethical theories, I teach these. This is a slide straight out of my Western Michigan class. And John Stuart Mill was a great ethicist who had the rule of utilitarianism, which probably governs all of corporate America today. That's how we have killed 3 people a week for many, many years with electricity, because we all love electricity, and we don't mind if a few people are grossly killed. So in utilitarianism, the idea is you pass laws and you have policies that promote the benefit of everyone. And it's like a cost-benefit analysis. And a utilitarian analysis of reparations would say, well, look what Evansville, Illinois. And if that kind of stimulus sort of approach works, maybe we should do this at Congress too. And maybe this would have a net benefit to our economy. And I do think it would. I mean, I think if you look at how we've done stimulus packages after 2008 and after the COVID disaster, it's pretty clear now that you can stimulate an economy by just giving people money. Now, I also have a picture here of my favorite philosopher, Immanuel Kant, because he was much more grounded in principle than Mill. Mill was just cost benefit, and frankly, if you have to kill 20 people to make 200 happy, it's okay with Mill. If you have to kill, it's how we do electricity, so utilitarianism runs our country. But ethics is where we get into what we should do because it's right. And it's pretty clear we're not allowed to kill people, we're not allowed to burn their town down and take all their property. I do like the purity of, and Kant has a guy named Rawls who followed him into the 20th century. And what he did is he said, I'm going to create an original position. It's an imaginary room like this. Say we're all in this room and none of us know what our, que sera, whatever will be, will be. We do not know what we're going to get in the economy and in the society. But we have to vote on what would be a fair and just society. So I'll have a vote here. Who in this room, if you didn't know anything about your life, would say, this reparation thing is pretty cruddy. I think they should get money. I know I would. I mean, so if you do this thought experiment, you come up with rules that probably will work better for everybody involved. And I think what we have is a problem where we started out being in charge and we don't want to do anything that would let us not be in charge. And by we, I mean us white folks. I'll close with candidate Kamala. This is when she was still a presidential candidate. She was the one in the debate who first mentioned reparations, right? And she had an interview where she characterized it as this. We have basically caused post-traumatic distress from slavery and Jim Crow in our black society. And what we need is sort of family intervention. Oh, my father fears our family interventions because he was a hoarder, right? And we'd have a family intervention saying this is dangerous. And, white society's not ready for this intervention, right? But it is similar to that. We have to be told, sorry, you're sitting on, like a dragon on a hoard, you're sitting on 10 times more wealth than the guy in the county next door who was black and held down by all these clever laws and cruelty. So if we get this H.R. 40, it could pass in this Congress or the next one. We can start to study this issue. We'll start to tease apart how we have 10 times more wealth than our black neighbors. I'm sure a lot of it's because we're super smart and we're super good, and that's probably at least half of it, right? I hope. And if we can't correct that housing inequity, we kind of have a problem, because we have part of our society that is at a disadvantage, that they don't have the opportunities, they have serious drug problems. It is a lot like an intervention. And we need to do something to make that society work as well, at least make it separate but equal, like the Plessy-Ferguson folks. We had a lot of work to do just under Plessy-Ferguson because it wasn't never equal. And I do think our society after COVID is a little more able to do what Andrew Wang, the candidate, said. We just need to have universal basic income. And I do a lot of work out in California with my tech clients, and they're all into UBI. Well, part of it is because AI is taking over the world, and we're all going to be just working for great artificial intelligence robots in the future. That's another HASS session I'd be happy to lead. And I think there's even here in Hope, I have a cousin who just took over. Bob Anderson became like a VP of development or something at Hope. And at Western Michigan and at Hope, there's a lot of movement giving free tuition, right? There's a lot of open doors to students these days. So I think we've got room to negotiate a metric of compensation that lets some of this economy get lifted out of its drug and crime-riddled problem, you know? And to the extent that we now have a Democratic, Kamala, she's the vice president now, right? So there may be movement when the Biden administration, whether it's on the Native Americans or on blacks, that we get a little closer to remedying a serious wrong that has just sat there for 100 years and more and has not been remedied. So I'll just close with that. I think this is inevitable. I talked about how climate liability is going to eventually hit for billions. And if you just watch Fox News, you're going to think it's never. Climate's a fraud, and so is reparations. But we do have precedents that are pointing us in the right direction. We knew what we had to do with the Japanese. We did a lot with Native Americans. Isn't it time we did something to correct some of the huge lynching in Tulsa and slavery, all these problems we've got that are uncompensated? I mean, we gave the black farmers money, and by the way, during COVID, there was another black farmer award that basically would give them a loan based on that problem with the Pigford case. They said, we still have a problem with equity, so we're letting these people have debt relief. Well, they didn't give it to the white farmers, so they got sued. And I will thank you. At this point, I've gone for an hour and 7 minutes, so I hope that I haven't overstayed my welcome, but I did want to leave time for questions. So this is a big issue, folks. How do we solve it? I'd love to hear from some of you smart folks.
I think Kim is going to look at chat questions first.
Yeah, let's let the chats answer, and be sure when you get your hand up to wait for the microphone from Larry. Any chatting questions there, Kim?
I don't have any typed in. So if there are about 25 people on Zoom. If any of you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment, now would be a good time.
Excuse me, this is Bob Kenny. Just commenting, you were talking about Evansville, Illinois, and I think it's Evanston, and the way they are justifying reparations is they're taking all the benefits, all the dollars they're getting from the sale of recreational marijuana, and they're putting all that money into a reparation fund. So it's a
Yeah, you're correct. I misspoke. That Evansville's an Indiana town.
It's a real convenient, they're spending money they never had before, which is really kind of cool.
Yeah, some of the marijuana statutes actually require that you be a former criminal to take a license, that you used to sell drugs. There's this saying, we're going to turn you into we're going to give you a decent living. Here you go. Nobody else will hire you because you're a felon, but we will hire you to sell drugs because it's now legal, and we shouldn't have put you in jail in the first place. Any other questions? Thank you for correcting me on that. I appreciate that. Any mouths moving and they're not muted?
Well, I keep seeing little yellow boxes, and I think they're talking, but I have a question, if I can, from the classroom. Can you define HR 40 a little more?
Sure.
It sounds like it's basically legislation.
It's a
to start the
resolution.
problem, right?
It's a House resolution. That's where the HR comes from. And there are current sponsors who are committed to doing this, and they're holding hearings, but they have yet to get a vote to say we're going to have a commission. So if you Google HR 40 congressional hearing, you can, like I said, there's grandstanding Republicans, and there's people like Viola, tearfully telling how they burned my town down. And it's actually, I had it running while I was making dinner, and I was like very distracted. I almost burned my spaghetti. But yeah, it's something that I recommend all of you follow up on. That Congress should, after 30 years of being asked to do something, and with 170-year-old people who were not allowed to sue, somebody should say, yeah, maybe we should have done something and have an investigation. They're investigating the Native Americans. Why can't they investigate the blacks, right? So part of the problem is it's such a big issue. It's kind of a scary big issue.
Okay, there's one in the chat. Is anything going on with reparations in Michigan?
In Michigan, well, we do have people who can vote in Congress, but our state government has not, to my knowledge, had any similar reparations issue brought forth. So I don't know. What I'll do, I'll follow up on that. If there has been something that missed my attention, I'll bring it up. But I haven't heard of any. Anybody in the room heard of any Michigan town or council or county anywhere doing any reparation? I guess nothing's happened in Michigan yet, but we all live here, so let's make something happen.
Right. Then another question is, how did the Greenwood Foundation get started?
There were some lawyers in Tulsa, and they basically started raising money. They formed a 501c3, and through various different sources of funding. They have a Form 990. I haven't looked at how they're funded from different groups, but they do have a compelling issue of basically they're the ones doing what HR 40 should have been doing. They're tracing the diaspora, and they're actually, through their foundation funds, awarding. My guess is if I read their Form 9090, they got attention from big, charitable foundations that have lots of money that would love to see something happen on this issue. And possibly they may even have some government money, but you'd have to look at their forms to see where their funding comes from. But good
I have a question. Would can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you.
Would the opening of all the Native American casinos in the state in Michigan be considered reparations?
Well, I'd like to think anything that helps them, it probably wouldn't be given that name, but it certainly, I would say it has helped the Native American community to have more funding, right? And you certainly see the benefits to the tribes in various places. Although there are some tribal leaders I've talked to who said, yeah, well, it's a blessing and a curse, but I'm sorry, it's money. So right. I don't think anybody would call that reparations, but I do think when they have sued for past wrongs and collected, that is clearly a reparations type payment. But it wouldn't hurt, and it's certainly good to have that fund. Any other questions? Oh yeah, we have one in the room. And if you could tell us who you are, since we can't read your name tag from a distance.
Okay. I'm Joe Buttry. Anyway, I lived in Montgomery, New Jersey, about 20 miles from New York, and there was a definite red line. I mean, there was a Washington Avenue went, and on one side, nobody but white could. Sugar Ray Robinson, who did not have problems with money, was not allowed to buy a house.
Wow.
In Upper Montgomery, New Jersey. That's in the, probably not that way now. That was like.
Well, my cousin lived in Montclair, New Jersey. I've been there a lot of times. So yeah, no, it's typical. I lived in Clayton, Missouri, where the line was Delmar Avenue, and across Delmar is where the black people lived. And
Montclair was Watchung Avenue,
yep.
Watchung being the after the mountains.
And until I lived there and actually, bought a house, I didn't know just how clever they were at doing it. It's really, just don't put it on the market. Give it to a rich lawyer, right?
There's a question in the chat. Do you know where the lynching memorial is located?
Oh, yes, Montgomery, Alabama. And for those of you who can now travel after COVID, I recommend it highly. It has a whole trail from Selma to Montgomery, and there's museums, including this compelling memorial. So my father and I made a whole vacation out of it, and it helps to have a niece in Montgomery that got Milty out of his bed. And it is something worth seeing. I recommend it to everyone.
And then there's another one. Do you see any connection between the current brouhaha over teaching the history of race in America, now called critical race theory, and fear over reparations?
Yeah, I think they're joined at the hip. I had one mention of that early in the presentation. But yes, when you talk about the critical race theory, the reparations issue is blended into it. And that's part of why people really don't want to have critical race theory in the schools. They don't want anybody talking about reparations. Yes, sir. And identify yourself if you can.
Okay, my name is Tom Glover.
Brother.
And the argument you hear from the right is, why should I take my money, or our corporate money from the whole society, to pay for something that our ancestors or our predecessors did that was wrong?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure as a coach in our argument, but I'm just wondering how you might respond to that. In other words, you're taking my money and paying for something that my predecessors did, and that's not right.
Yeah. Well, there is a simple answer from the philosophers of the world. Because it's the right thing to do. Do not be so short-sighted, sir. And there's a thing in the law called ill-gotten gains. So if you're an innocent party who comes by, somebody hands you the Brooklyn Bridge, you say, "Thank you for the Brooklyn Bridge." No, you don't get to keep it, right? Because he stole it. So similar, when somebody steals or by force or fraud comes by property, you don't get to keep it, even if you're the great, great, great 99th time grandson. That's not right. I had this argument with my libertarian uncle, who I helped almost get elected in California. And he said, you keep your property unless it's by force or fraud. And that's where his argument on reparations would fall to the ground. Because I'd say there was a lot of force and there was a lot of fraud for them to get to this point. And even today, we're still collecting equity that is wrongfully collected. So the profits that we make the profit I made on my house in Del Mar, California, was all ill-gotten gain. And I'm sorry, I know I'd like to keep it all because I'm a really smart lawyer who worked really hard, and so I should keep most of it, right? But I just have a hard time when people say, well, because my great-grandfather was Adolf Hitler, I don't think I should be I mean, that's basically what they're saying. We have problems here that make Hitler look like a kindergarten student. So I'm sorry, we do have a good argument to be made from a philosopher, okay? I'm just, the philosophers of the world would say, oh my gosh, this is a horrible thing you did. And look, you have all this property that you collected from the horrible people. So it's a short hop from the law into reparations. It's not the reach that Ben Shapiro and everybody tries to make it into. There's metrics, and there's a wrongdoing, and there's a ill-gotten gain, and you just have to say, wait a minute, maybe I earned this through wrongful means. And no, I didn't do anything wrong, right? But my father did, and he gave it all to me, and now these people want it back, right? So, yeah, no, I'm sorry. I like to argue with Republicans because I always win on this issue. I'm going out to my brother-in-law. I can't wait to have him bring it up, Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm going to spend the holidays watching Fox News nonstop in San Diego, California, where my right-wing brother-in-law will educate me about all my errors. And if I want to eat dinner, I probably shouldn't win that argument. But
There's another question asking, how realistic do you think it is that courts will toll statutes of limitations for claims by African Americans?
so if I was asked to bet my house payment on this, I'd say it's about as likely as both Michigan and Michigan State will beat Ohio State. About a 1 in 10 chance, I would think. So it takes a brave judge to make law. You have to hope that you don't get overturned on appeal. And you got to hope that it goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, which is the same group that just said voting rights isn't a problem, says, yes, you should have equitable tolling. So I got to say, I'm not optimistic that the courts, even though I see a perfectly good reason for them to do it, will adopt my perfectly good reason given the current structure of our legal system. That means Congress and states and local governments have to act. Yes, sir. Gary.
Question from the room. What is the rationale for what level of government should be paying reparations and why?
Well, the rationale would be who can do it first. So if you have the federal government should be the person to correct what happened nationwide. But if the federal government is unable to act and a state or a local agency says, I think this is a sensible thing to do, one of the things we pride ourselves on is we have 50 states who can experiment. And the federal system lets them test out policies and see if they work. So we'll see if this turning the cannabis money into reparations money works. That may be the model, because cannabis is sweeping the country. There's money just sitting on the table. So maybe that's the linkage of the states with cannabis funds turning it all into a reparation system. Yes?
Another question?
Thank you,
Could-
Senator.
How would you define critical race theory?
Am I speaking or what?
I heard recently that there was Indian tribes that had bought truck concern in this area,
Oh,
and I felt very encouraged. It brought my spirits up. There are Indians that are speaking out and doing something.
right,
And
yeah.
it's local.
Mm-hmm. That may be some of the funds that come from gambling. I don't know.
I'm Mary Voss,
Yes.
and I think education
Right.
now with a big read, I'm learning about the trail up here.
Mm-hmm.
I knew about it, but no details. Now reading details, it just makes your heart.
Right.
What we did.
These are compelling stories.
You know, and if they're fighting this education in their schools, then we need to learn this.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone
Right.
who has not read the book, Cast, I would highly recommend that book by Isabel Robinson.
Mm-hmm. Did we have other questions coming in on chat?
I have a question. How would you define critical race theory?
Well, there was a good article in the Atlantic that talked about it, and I'll go with that. It basically says what it is looking at what we've already researched and doing kind of a meta-analysis to dig in and see if this white-led cause of correcting race helped and how it maybe didn't help. It's my grandfather used to have a thing, good enough for government work, and it's clear. Basically, some people are saying what we did to correct race actually backfired. And there's more work to be done is the main thing. So, you tell that to the Supreme Court and they say, oh, don't worry, the Voting Rights Act isn't needed anymore, except when it is. Other questions? I'm happy to keep talking past 11 if need be.
So was there anything learned from the reparations for Japanese Americans in terms of who would qualify and how much they would get that would be applicable if and when Congress decides to do reparations?
Yeah, I was taught it in law school, and I'm sure the lawyer at the Greenwood Foundation who's doing the Tulsa tracing had the same class I had, talking about Korematsu And so there's a lot of knowledge out there in the reparations community about how to turn the Korematsu case into the black case. And that's why they're tracing the diaspora. They need to have people. They need to have actual people to trace. And anyone who can't be found doesn't share in the wealth. Korematsu, you had to be in an internment camp.
In that same area of what you're speaking of in Japanese internment, there were roughly 110,000 people in the internment camps.
Mm-hmm.
And do you know how many people received those reparations in that court case? Was it close to 20,000?
Well, I don't know the numbers, but I could look into that. I
What was
do
the
know
question?
people who got it. My brother's
What
boss.
was the question, Tom?
The question was how many of the people interned in the camps actually collected. And bear in mind, they weren't just put in the camps. People moved into their houses and told them to go away when they came back to their own farms and houses. They were robbed as well as interned. So it's a horrible episode in American history. Any other questions from the Zoom gang?
There's just a comment that it seems like reparations for Blacks is such a difficult group to garner support versus garnering support for people that were Native American or Japanese.
Well, there is a difference in law because they're enforcing contracts in some of those billion-dollar cases. The oil and gas contracts were written down. Treaties, they were written down for water. So what the blacks don't have is a promise from the government to pay that they're enforcing, and that does make it a little bit more difficult. But tort and contract work in parallel. Tort is the physical injury world, and there you just need a person. That's why they're doing the tracing of the diaspora in Tulsa. That's why they listed everybody on the lynching memorial. And once you have a person, you just have to prove it was caused and that they were wronged. And there's no question they were wrong. They had their life taken away.
And for Japanese Americans, it wasn't just people who were still alive in the 1980s, it was their relatives, right? Their
Right.
descendants?
It definitely was, yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Let me, this is Larry Lynn. Let me do a sales pitch for a class in Winter Spring that I did 3 years ago called Japanese Internment
Oh,
in America during World War II. So this will discuss everything except the court case. It'll discuss how this happened, where it happened, and for example, how mean, if I could use that term, we took over their property, we took over their houses, and et cetera. So keep that in mind when you look at the curriculum for next winter, spring.
well, if there's a silver lining to the Korematsu case, it's that Justice Warren, who was the Brown v. Board justice, was the Attorney General of California who locked everybody up, so he probably had some guilt that led him to get a 9-0 verdict in the Brown v. Board. You never know. 3 minutes to go. Somebody must have a question about this incredibly impossible issue. I wish I had Fred Johnson here because he taught me in the Tulsa case, and he said, "Oh, that reparations." And so maybe I'll send him my slides and say, "What do you think of these, Fred?"
Just want to say thank you, and there are several thank yous on.
Tom, I want to thank you very
Oh,
much
thank you.
for a very interesting, thought-provoking reparation,
Yeah.
and I really appreciate you doing this for us. So,
Well,
please
yeah.
do it.
Thank you. I love the questions because I now